In the summer of 2021, my husband Joseph and I bought our first house together. It's been nearly a year since then, and trauma healing certainly has its ups and downs. But overall, I'd really say I'm doing better. About a year ago, Joey and I were recently married, although we'd been together nearly 6 years. We weren't high school sweethearts per se, but we'd been close since sophomore year. He was kind and empathetic, truly a big softie. Maybe it was because of his own struggles as a trans kid in our small rural town. And you can imagine my excitement when we found a quaint, comfortable, affordable house to buy. What you could not imagine are the horrors that made themselves at home there long before we did. The house was an hour outside of my hometown, sitting at the end of a winding, hilly, unnamed road. It was mostly a faded off-white colour, but the accents of the place were a charming pale blue. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, and a small basement and attic for storage. It was a bit run down, with stains in odd places and floors that creaked at odd times, but to Joey and I, it only made the house feel more special. After all, it was our home. We were people with quirks, we thought. Why not have a house with quirks? In hindsight, I suppose this is where the first lesson of my story comes in. I've always been an anxious person, from a young age. I found monsters in shadows, strangers in the dark, unspeakable terrors in the face of uncertainty. No one saw more of this than Joe, who found he needed to regularly assist in calming my nerves. "No, dear," he'd assure, "your mother hasn't fallen ill. No, darling, that sound wasn't the start of a break-in. No, my love, you didn't forget to lock the doors. Do you want to go check them again?" Joey's patience should have earned him medals and awards as far as I'm concerned. The thing about anxiety is that it often feels like intuition. Oftentimes we are told to trust our gut, but I've spent my entire life learning to ignore mine. So, when my nerves kept me up past midnight on our first night sleeping in our new house, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. In hindsight, I suppose this was my first mistake. On that first night, I chose to wander through the house in an attempt to perhaps bore myself to sleep. Sliding on some slippers, I carefully made my way to the kitchen. I set the kettle on the stove. Nothing calms a restless mind quite like chamomile tea, and let myself pace calmly as I waited for the water to boil. The room was cold, and I felt my hair stand up on my arms as though it was desperately trying to escape my skin. I crossed my arms close to my chest in an attempt to stay warm and put the feeling out of my mind. With a bit of a shiver, I turned to continue my pacing around the room. It was at this point my eyes landed on the faint square shapes on the wall next to the hallway leading to the bedroom. Perhaps a safe? Perhaps a cubby of sorts. Whatever it was, it had seemingly been covered by paint and wallpaper, sealing it away. In my sleep-deprived state, my mind could make nothing of value of the shape. My body, however, seemed to know it was something my mind had yet to catch on to. As I traced the square in the wall with the line of my sight, my heart began to pound so loudly that I feared the sound would wake Joe. My legs seemed to move on their own, slowly stepping closer to the wall. And as my hand reached out to touch it, my heart prepared to burst from my chest, my mind growing foggy with panic. The kettle began to sing. The loud, high squeal of the kettle snapped me so aggressively out of my panicked trance that I wondered briefly if I'd dreamt the entire thing. With shaking hands, I poured my tea, forcing myself to make use of each deep breathing technique I'd picked up over the years. All of a sudden, Though my nervousness had yet to subside, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. In an instant, I wanted nothing more than to doze off in the warmth of my bed and the soft comfort of Joey's arms. I walked back to my bedroom, set my cup of tea on the nightstand and crawled into bed. As I closed my eyes, I decided to chalk the panic up to fatigue and being in a new environment. Sleep took me quickly into its grasp, and I didn't spare the square in the wall another thought. Perhaps this was my second mistake. In the weeks following that first night, I nearly forgot about the entire event and the square in the wall. Between working and trying to adjust to the new house, I managed to keep my anxious mind mostly occupied. It wasn't until I started to have nightmares about the damn thing that I remembered its presence. They started out scattered and relatively manageable, this being about a month into living into the house. Every couple of nights, a snake would slither out from a square-shaped hole in the wall, coiling around my neck until it snapped. A swarm of bees would use their stingers to nail me against the square spot. Each nightmare left me groggy and irritable the next day. I ended up taking my stress out on poor Joey. While this isn't a mistake in regards to my story, it certainly is in my overall life. I love Joe dearly and will always be eternally grateful for his patience with me. It wasn't long before the nightmares were coming every night. Spiders crawling from the wall, clowns and murderers bursting through it, a latch on the square opening to reveal the fiery eternal damnation of hell. It wasn't much longer before the nightmares progressed to night terrors. I'd wake up screaming, sweating, clinging to Joey and sobbing like a baby. Eventually, every evening consisted mostly of me crying. First over the terror of falling asleep, then again after I'd woken up. I began to fall into depression. I was constantly sleep deprived. My paranoia became so heightened that I hardly even left my room. A week of this went by, my symptoms only worsening. Joey took care of me best he could, but after 22 days of this entire ordeal, he was no longer able to coddle me. Joey was scheduled to fly out to Europe with his brother in order to get a subcutaneous mastectomy, a masculinizing chest surgery. It was something he had been waiting for his entire life. Top surgery wait lists had been hellish, but at long last the time had come. Yet here I was, a nervous wreck, unable to leave my room for anything other than the toilet. It was at this point I realized I needed to get myself together. I'll admit, I was terrified to be without him. However, I knew I'd never forgive myself if I held him back like this. From deep down inside myself, I pulled forth all the mental strength I had. I was going to be all right, I assured both Joey and myself. On day 23 of this, nearly 2 months into living in the house, I got out of bed and cleaned. I caught up on work. I took care of myself. On day 24, I cooked lunch and dinner and did all I could to be helpful around the house. Although my night terrors persisted, I forced myself up in the mornings and all through the day. In the end, it paid off. Joe pushed to stay home, insisting he needed to take care of me, but I stood my ground. I was okay. I could handle myself, I assured. Eventually, he acquiesced and I kissed him goodbye before he left for the airport. In spite of all my preformed confidence, I was still scared to be at home without him. My fears only proved to be valid when on the 25th night, I had the worst night terror yet. In this dream, I'd been unable to move or blink. I was sat on the floor, in front of the wall, with the square only a foot away. In the dream, the square shape was made of a thread sewn into the wall. Slowly but surely, the thread was pulled out, and a door swung open. Inside was a dark, damp, cube-shaped hole, filled with nothing but dust and mold. It reeked of blood and of mildew, yet I was paralyzed, unable to even recoil from the smell. Then slowly and deliberately, my body began to move toward it. As if some invisible force were pushing me, my limbs moved into the hole in the wall, followed by my hips, my torso, and my head. This hole was in no way big enough for me to fit in, and yet in I went. I heard my bones crunch and crack and snap as I was pressed further and further into the wall, and right as I could hear the door about to close, trapping me there forever, I woke up. On the 26th night, the dream repeated. On the 27th night, the dream repeated. On the 28th night, 3 weeks after my first night terror, I suppose something snapped in me. I woke up screaming for the umpteenth time from the same dream I'd had 3 nights before. My mind felt dazed, my body felt tingly. Before I really knew what I was doing, I climbed out of my bed and raced toward the kitchen. As if the gods themselves had plotted this, a full moon shone through the window, casting a perfect spotlight on the square shape in my wall. My mind felt on fire. My limbs soared with electricity. I banged my fists on the wall, clawed at it until my fingertips grew numb, searched and felt every angle for a latch or a knob. And then I saw it. A hammer, sitting on the kitchen counter. The world seemed to move in slow motion as I walked toward the hammer. A part of me registered how heavy it was in my hand, how much damage it was capable of doing. And yet, as I stepped back towards the square that had been plaguing my mind for weeks, the logical part of my mind sank far, far down into my gut. I felt my hand raise. I felt the impact of the hammer against the wall. I felt it again, and again, and again. I saw dust settle. I saw the broken, jagged hole. And most importantly, I saw a plank of wood. The plank of wood to which the square outline in the wall belonged. I let the hammer fall to the floor beside me, sinking to my knees as to be at eye level with the square. Locking my fingers around the exposed corners of the wooden plank, I mustered up all my strength in my body, and I pulled. This was my final mistake. The first thing I saw was an eye, wide and red, staring straight at me. After that was the arm, broken and severed at the elbow. Bone jutted out of it, poking the flesh of the cheek as it pressed against. Then was the mouth, open, as though the head was still screaming, still breathing. Another arm showed from behind the head, the wrist bent to fit against it. A leg which had clearly been flattened against the hard plank seemed to frame the rest of the corpse. The knee was bent backward, and the ankle and foot pointed in a direction I felt in my soul it was not meant to be. Dried, caked blood streaked the pale, greyed, stretched skin, blending the cross from skin to muscle to exposed, jagged bone. The last thing I saw was the thread. Red and black threads stitched limbs together, stretched skin, held the eyes open, pinned the mouth wide and gaping. Gaping like it was still yelling, still screaming. Screaming, screaming a sound that ran warm blood frigid ice cold, screaming for its life, screaming. I heard screaming. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in a hospital bed a few days later, and I can't remember anything after that until even further down. My memories of the next month or so are spotty. At some point, Joey came back home. At some point, we left the house. At some point, I stopped crying. I just don't remember the details. But what I do remember was the sound of shrieking, the withered, pale face pulled to a scream. And I do remember that even though I now realise that scream erupted from my own throat, it was deeply, surely, and certainly not my own. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to support this channel, we have a link in the description for that. Don't forget to give a subscribe, a like, and press the bell to get notifications. Tell us your thoughts in the comments section. You can also send us your real or fictional horror stories.